Good evening to all of you in Sri Lanka. Good morning to Shanta, to you in Washington. It's a tremendous pleasure as well as a privilege to have Shanta Devarajan on this webinar. Shanta has been a long-standing friend, I think childhood friend, I would say. Our two fathers had similar career trajectories, starting in the Ceylon Civil Service and then ending up in the UNDP. And Shanta has a stellar record, both academically as well as in terms of his working life. He got his first degree in mathematics from Princeton, went on to do a PhD in econometrics from Berkeley, then went to work at Harvard at the Kennedy School, moved across to the World Bank, where he has been for over 20 years now. And at the World Bank, I think he is unique in the sense that he has been senior economist for 3 of the regions, that is South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and North Africa, and the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region. And each time he was sent to these regions when there were problems. So he was very much a troubleshooter who was sent around as a chief economist. And finally, he finished as the acting chief economist of the World Bank. So it is a really stellar career that Shanta had, and it's a great privilege for us to have him here to share some of his views. As you know, the theme for this webinar is what can Sri Lanka, the World Bank, and IMF learn from each other? So to start with, Shanta, maybe very briefly, we can go back to the genesis of the 2 Bretton Woods institutions, set up in the wake of the Bretton Woods. Is there something? Bretton Woods conference, and at that time, there was a very clear demarcation of the roles of the 2 institutions. Since then, there's been a fair amount of mission creep, but still there is a clear identity that each of them has. So maybe you can just talk us through the history and where the 2 institutions are in terms of their roles, their respective roles.
Okay, thanks very much, Indrajit, and it's a real pleasure to be here and nice to have this discussion. I should just say one thing. I mean, after this very flowery description of my career, actually, I just want to add that I am currently a professor at Georgetown University, just to emphasize that I'm not speaking on behalf of the World Bank because I'm no longer there. Yes. I have retired.
I should have been clear about that.
Yes. That's okay. Yeah, so the 2 Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, were born out of the chaos following World War II, when the global economy was in shambles and several countries were devastated by the war itself. And the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire identified the need for 2 institutions. One was to keep the world safe from future capital account crises, financial crises like the one we had in 2008. And the other was the reconstruction of these economies that were devastated from the war. And those were the 2 institutions. The IMF was created basically to keep the world global financial system stable. And the World Bank was created for the reconstruction. It's interesting, the name of the World Bank was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. But over time, these 2 institutions evolved because on the one hand, global financial stability really amounted to focusing on countries that ran into balance of payments difficulties and trying to correct those balance of payments difficulties, which is what the fund's activities were. And the World Bank realized that once you got the reconstruction of France and Japan and Germany done, the real issue was the developing countries who needed a lot of capital for growth as well as for reducing high levels of poverty. And so they evolved into the World Bank as an institution for development finance for developing countries. Now, as you said, there's been some mission creep because I think in both cases, we've realized that the separation of functions is not as clear cut as it could be. For instance, when the IMF tries to help countries with balance of payments difficulties, you realize that some of those balance of payments difficulties have to do with the structure of the economy and the long-term growth prospects of the economy. If the economy doesn't grow, chances are it's going to run into balance of payments difficulties. So the IMF started looking at the structural aspects of an economy. Conversely, the World Bank realized that while countries needed development finance to build bridges and roads and schools and things like that, at the same time, many of these countries were suffering from structural problems. The reasons why these bridges and roads were not actually delivering was that the policy framework in these countries, the trade policies and the industrial policies were so distorted. So you would actually be building bridges and roads to the wrong places, or you'd be encouraging the production of crops that were really not lucrative for the country. And so they also got involved, the World Bank got involved in the policy dialogue, trying to get countries to remove the policies. I mean, and in particular, things like overvalued exchange rates and trade reforms. And so that's why the two institutions have come closer together in terms of both are involved with policy reforms, but they come at it from different reasons. One is to prevent balance of payments difficulties from recurring, and the other is to enable the investment projects to be actually productive.
Great, thank you very much. Now, I think it's fair to say, Shanta, that the two Bretton Woods institutions over time have had image problems. There is a perception in the developing world, in many quarters really, that they're dominated by the West, and that the governance structure of both institutions reflects more the world of 1948 than of 2021. And that these institutions are not as sensitive as they should be to specific country situations. Now, I know over time, both institutions have actually tried to become more flexible and more receptive. But I think this is an image issue that is still a problem for the institutions.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And you're right to call it an image problem. At one level, it's quite straightforward that the IMF usually comes into a country when the country has suffered a major shock. For instance, price of oil falls by 50%. And next thing you know, the IMF is in Nigeria, because Nigeria has just suffered a shock, which is of the order of 20% of GDP, when the price of oil falls by 50%. So Nigeria is in deep trouble at that point. And in fact, what the IMF is trying to do is provide them with finance so that you can smooth the adjustment out of the shock. There's no question that when your price of oil falls by 50%, you have to adjust because you're now 25% poorer. But on the other hand, you can do it in a smooth way, or you can do it in a drastic way. And the IMF is trying to provide the financing in order to smooth that transition. The problem is, of course, the people in Nigeria, all they see is they're having to tighten their belts, and the IMF is in town, and there are pictures of the IMF mission in the newspapers and things like that. So they associate the IMF for having to tighten their belts. And of course, it's very convenient for the government to also say, oh, we're not making you do this. The IMF is making you do this. I sometimes, I draw the analogy. It's like if you have a fire in your house, you call in the fire brigade, and the fire brigade comes in and they do all sorts of things. They break down doors and walls in order to contain the fire. But people don't necessarily blame the fire brigade for the fire. And that's the way you should think about the IMF. They come in and they do things that are actually painful, but they're necessary because without the IMF, they would have been even more painful. And that's why this is an image problem, and it's inevitable because you associate the IMF with bad news. But that's because the IMF came in after the bad news came out. Now that's one side of it. The other, and you were alluding to that in the second half of your question, is that as part of the financing that both the World Bank and the IMF provide, there are policy conditions. They have introduced policies. And again, it's for the same reasons as I mentioned before. From the IMF side, it's these policy changes are required in order to smooth the adjustment out of the crisis. In the World Bank's case, these policies are necessary in order to make that financing productive. But again, some of these conditions are viewed as unnecessarily draconian. And in some cases, as you suggested, they're the same whether you're in Zimbabwe or in Kenya or in Sri Lanka or in Thailand. And so it's, I think the phrase is used, a one size fits all type of phrase. And so it's also, people have been questioning those conditions quite rightly. And I think the third problem, which is maybe even more disturbing, is that the track record of these structural adjustment loans in the starting in the late 1970s, early 1980s. In fact, this year is the 40th anniversary of the first structural adjustment loan by the World Bank, into the 1990s, the track record was not very good. So these countries got lots of structural adjustment loans, all of which had conditions, and the conditions were to liberalize the trade regime, deregulate financial markets, devalue the exchange rate, reduce tariffs, and so on. And growth in Africa, for instance, didn't increase. They were just as poor at the end of the 90s as they were at the beginning of the 90s. And so that's very disturbing. And again, people have criticized it because they said, well, obviously these policies were the wrong policies. And the fact that it was a one size fits all sort of confirms that these policies did not take into account the local political conditions or the local conditions in the country. Rather, they came and insisted. And frankly, there was a little bit of this gets back to your idea of the power balance in the World Bank. There was a bit of the country would the IMF or the World Bank would insist on these policies, and they would force them on the country, and that was did not go over very well. Yeah, actually, I know in one case in Brazil, during the debt crisis in Brazil, the IMF mission chief, a character playing the IMF mission chief, actually appeared on one of the soap operas in Brazil. He was one of the people that they knew him so well that he became part of the local culture. But now we have looked at this, and I myself have studied this a bit. Is this the history of structural adjustment and the track record and what made the difference? And the answer is a lot more subtle, I would say, than just, oh, structural adjustment is bad, these were the wrong policies, and you guys screwed up. The truth of the matter is, many of these countries that undertook structural adjustment loans, they did meet the conditions in order, for the most part, they met the conditions in order to get the money. But basically, after they got the money, they either reversed the conditions or they didn't implement them, or they actually added on new policies that circumvented the old ones. And you might find this familiar because I think Sri Lanka has experienced this as well. But I've documented it in sub-Saharan Africa in many cases. But the other side of that, which is, well, there are several aspects of this that we need to keep in mind. The other is that these policies were politically difficult. That some people, I mean, say you have a import protection. Now, with import protection, what you have is that some industries are protected. Say cement or whatever, some chemical industry. That means somebody is actually earning profits in that industry, even though that's not a productive industry. You're not able to export or even compete with imports because you have protection. Now, those people sometimes are very powerful politically in the country. So if the condition is you've got to reduce the protection of the cement industry, the government is stuck because they have to alienate somebody who may be a major political supporter to them, who may actually make the difference for the next election. And this is the dilemma. And frankly, I think many governments then have used this as a way of saying, well, we don't really want to do this, but the World Bank makes us do it, or the IMF makes us do it. But it's a way of absolving themselves from what they basically need to do, and it's not helping them at all by keeping this protection. But the third aspect, which is worth keeping in mind, is what goes on inside the World Bank, which is people have to understand that there's also some pressure in the World Bank to actually undertake these loans. I mean, they're good because we think these are good things for the government to do, and also the government is in trouble, they need the money, and there's a fair amount of pressure, I would say, to make sure these loans go through. And so the World Bank also sometimes overlooks the fact that the conditions haven't been met. So the bank, for instance, gave 3 structural adjustment loans in a row to Kenya for the same price reform policies. So the first loan they gave, condition was you got to reform maize prices. They didn't do it, but the bank said, but they're about to do it, so let's give them another loan. They still didn't do it. So we said, but now they're ready to do it, so we gave them a third loan. They still haven't done it, by the way. Right, so, but you can see that, so there's pressure on both sides. As a result, conditionality didn't really get implemented. So my conclusion about that was that it was not that the policies were the wrong policies, but they weren't genuinely owned, or there wasn't a political consensus for undertaking those policy reforms in the countries. And frankly, it was also sometimes it was a discussion among technocrats like us on both sides of the table, without either of us actually paying attention to the political realities on the ground. I just give you one other quick example. In Zambia, when Kaunda stepped down and Chiluba became the president, everybody, the bank and the fund were cheering because finally we had a new government with a fresh look. And there was a finance minister who, quote, we were able to talk to, who spoke our language, which meant that he was probably a graduate of MIT or something. And the finance minister agreed with the IMF and the bank of a series of reforms, including maize price reform, coincidentally, the same thing as in Kenya. And they signed a whole series of structural adjustment loans. The trouble is the finance minister hadn't bothered to consult with, not only consult with the public, but he hadn't even consulted his fellow cabinet members. And it turns out that agricultural price reform, which is what maize price reform was, is the province of the agriculture minister, not the finance minister. So when this thing came for signature, the reform came to the agricultural minister said, I never agreed to this. So I'm not going to do it. And the whole program was stalled and it fell apart. And that's the cost of undertaking policies that you don't haven't checked whether there is a political consensus.
I think that's not unfamiliar to us in Sri Lanka. This whole thing about ownership, building consensus around reforms, there have been a few countries which have done this successfully, right? And how have they gone about, achieving this success?
Well, not only a few countries, but I think the bank has changed its approach to conditions as well. Because the syndrome I was describing earlier, which is that the country pretends to do reform, they get the money, and then they reverse it. That syndrome isn't helpful. And the bank has then decided that they're not going to approach conditionality that way. They actually completely revamped the approach to conditionality. So it isn't a case of you have to agree to do these reforms and then you'll get the money, but to reverse that the other way and say, you tell us what the reforms you are doing, you want to do. These are what I call prior actions. And if the combination of those reforms constitutes what we think of as a potential growth program, a program that will encourage growth and inclusive growth, then you'll get the money. So it's something where the government actually has to actually undertake the policies rather than promise to undertake them and get the money. You actually having had to have taken the policies, implemented them, and then you get the money. And that also gives much more flexibility because there's some, as you know, there's some reforms that are politically feasible at certain times and some that are not. So if there's an opening for tariff reform in a particular time, you do those, but you don't do the electricity pricing or tariff reform because there's no political consensus around that. And you have to keep those two separate. So it doesn't mean that you have to do all these reforms. You do enough reforms that constitute a reform program. And one thing we've learned over the years is you want to do enough reforms that signal that there won't be a reversal. So some of these are commitments that you can't really turn back around. And that actually has led to quite a lot of progress. I mean, I would say the countries that have done this most successfully over the years, two that in the study of Africa that I identified were Uganda and Ghana. And in both cases, the Uganda reform program, the structural adjustment programs, before they even discussed it in parliament, they held town meetings all over the country, in villages, actually trying to explain what they were needing to do, as well as eliciting opinions of the people as to what their priorities were. And what this meant, I mean, it doesn't mean that they did everything that the people asked for, but at least the people felt like they had been consulted. And Ghana is the same way. In Ghana, Kwesi Bachwe, who was a friend of mine, who was the finance minister at the time, he used to go on TV every day to explain what it meant, to unify the exchange rate in simple terms, so that everybody knew before they ever did it. They had to go, so it's very different. It's a very different culture, I would say, from the idea that you do all these things in secret behind closed doors and then suddenly you surprise people with the reforms. Rather, you let it build up organically from below. And it is no coincidence that Ghana and Uganda were the two structural adjustment programs that were sustained over time in Africa.
I must say, I think I can personally testify to the fact that there has been a change in the approach to institutions, because the last program, but having been in the central bank, I see it more from the perspective of the IMF. Number of the reforms, like the new central bank bill and the flexible inflation targeting regime within it, the new banking act, debt management strategy, strengthening fiscal rules. These were all things that my former colleagues in the central bank really were in the driving seat. These are things that they wanted done, and they came from within the institution. And we then announced these as things that we could do and we could include in the program. So I think, yeah, that's how it worked. Now, let me just change tack a little bit. Now, before I get on to specifically to Sri Lanka, you know, we see the fund coming in as a fireman. We see the bank supporting projects and programs. But I think, for instance, China, you would be telling me, has used the bank in a very different way, right? And to great effect. And I think that's something that many countries miss. And certainly in Sri Lanka, we probably have not really taken advantage of this resource.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. China borrows like $2 billion a year from the World Bank. And this is a country with, $1 trillion in reserves. And I used to ask the Chinese, why do you bother? What is it? And they were very clear. They said, we don't want the money. We don't need the money. We want your technical expertise. And we know, and they said one other thing, which is, we know that you would not have the commitment to give us the best technical expertise unless you had a project. And so they use the bank exclusively for the knowledge from the bank, but they use it in such a way that they can get the best out of it. And that's really the only reason why they continue to borrow. And this is something I actually think a lot of countries, low income and middle income countries, are beginning to realize that the real value of the World Bank is the knowledge that it can provide. And in many ways, this knowledge can be useful for unlocking some of this political polarization that countries are facing, including Sri Lanka. And I remember when I was chief economist in South Asia, I tried very hard to convince senior policymakers in the country, some of whom are still senior policymakers in the country, that where we can help Sri Lanka is actually doing knowledge work, doing analysis, and then putting it out to the public. If we take some of the problems in Sri Lanka, like the electricity price reform and things like that, where there's a deadlock and it's between the Ceylon Electricity Board and the public and everybody else. And it's a real serious problem. And yet, what we need to do, and usually the rhetoric is, oh, if you raise electricity prices, the poor will suffer because the poor are poor and they can't pay for it. But the truth of the matter is, the electricity subsidies are overwhelmingly going to the rich. Because they're the ones who consume more electricity and have air conditioners and things like that. By the way, then the other side of it is that you also have gasoline subsidies. And those also go to the rich because they are the ones driving the gas guzzling cars and drive around a lot more. And I remember a story in Sri Lanka where there was a power cut and it was during a hot season. So the air conditioning went out and a couple got into their car and using subsidized gasoline started driving around at night in the car because they could run the air conditioning in the car. Now, people who can afford to do that should be able to pay higher prices too. And we should not be subsidizing them. But the trouble is that this information, that the lion's share of energy subsidies goes to the rich or of fuel subsidies goes to the rich, is not widely known. But that's something the World Bank can actually provide, that information, and actually get it out there to the public. So everybody has the information, then they can make their decision whether they want to support the price reform or not. We don't necessarily need to recommend a solution. We just have to get that information out there. And it can be an incredibly powerful tool, that kind of knowledge. And the fact that it comes from the World Bank and comes from outside, and frankly, the bank has the economies of scale to undertake these large scale analytical projects, it can be particularly useful for small countries like Sri Lanka. And I really feel like that's something that Sri Lanka should have been taking advantage of as much as possible, the way the Chinese do. for the longest time without worrying too much about how much money there was. And particularly, once they graduated from IDA, the money was no longer concessional either. But the expertise, the knowledge, and the ability to make this knowledge available to the public is always there and should be taken more advantage of.
I think that's a very important point that you made, that once you graduate from low-income country status, from IDA status, and you're no longer eligible for concessional money, then actually IBRD money, is not that cheap, right? So a country like Sri Lanka, which has graduated, again, as you say, probably the greatest value that can be derived from these organizations is to tap into their knowledge base, which is based on work done in, over 100 countries, right? And you're able to see what has worked, what has not worked, to distill good practice, etc. And that knowledge base is something I think, we can do much better in terms of tapping into. Let me finally, really, if I can talk specifically on Sri Lanka. As you know, Sri Lanka has been a twin deficit country forever, right? We have a fiscal deficit, we have a current account deficit, and both are structural. And we went into the pandemic as a twin deficit country. And clearly, these problems have been amplified by the shock, by the extremely severe shock. And now the country is having to address major challenges on the fiscal, debt management, and reserve adequacy fronts. How do you see that the fund and the bank can assist Sri Lanka in addressing these issues?
Okay, I have advice for the Sri Lankans and I have advice for the World Bank. And from the point of view of the Sri Lankans, I think the situation is very serious, and you have a very serious debt problem, as well as the current account problems. And it looks like there has to be some kind of debt restructuring in order to prevent this problem from recurring year onwards. And the IMF is actually well placed to provide the technical assistance. This again comes back to the knowledge assistance. Give the technical assistance of different options of debt restructuring and different combinations of policies that could lead to a restructured debt profile. And they have lots of expertise on this. And they did the same thing for Argentina, for instance. And this is not the IMF dictating things; it's IMF doing the analysis needed with the government, with the Sri Lankans, to come up with a package of debt restructuring. That said, the advice I have for the World Bank is, and this is a little bit for people like you and me as well, who comment on the Sri Lankan situation. I would say, we've for a long time been harping on a series of major distortions in the Sri Lankan economy. I've talked about, the Paddy Lands Act or the electricity subsidies, huge problems that create huge costs to the functioning of the economy, trade restrictions and so on. But the thing is, we have to look at the long run trajectory of this country, that despite all of these distortions, which have been there for 30 years or even longer, the economy has gone from a low income country to a middle income country. During a 25-year civil war, per capita growth was almost 3% a year, right? So they're doing something right, despite these distortions. I mean, we harp on how much better you could do if you got rid of these distortions, which is true. But whatever it is, this economy manages to continue to perform at a pretty high level. The second thing is the fact that these distortions haven't moved in 50 years means that they're probably never going to move. There's never going to be a political consensus to reform the Paddy Lands Act. So maybe the best thing for the World Bank to do is to say, let's take these distortions as given. They're a constraint. They're not going to change it. And let's then figure out what we can do to help the economy grow by drawing lessons on how they actually grew in the past. And we've just done a piece on this in Sri Lanka, the country private sector diagnostic, I think it's called, where we've actually looked at how is it that they continue to grow despite all of these distortions. And basically, the bottom line is that there are entrepreneurs in Sri Lanka who try to work around the distortions. So even if there were some trade restrictions, they didn't apply to the electronics or the IT industry. And so they were able to go and do some innovative work in the IT industry. Or the labor regulations, which are really draconian, didn't apply as much in the free trade zone. So you had the garment industry take off because they weren't subject to those labor regulations. And now the garment industry has grown into a much more sophisticated, high-tech version of the garment industry. And the third is the labor market, which is actually quite interesting. And actually, this is something I learned from you, Indrajit, that in the 70s and 80s, Sri Lanka had a crisis because that was the youth bulge. There were a large number of young people entering the labor market, and there were no jobs because of these labor restrictions and all of these labor regulations and all of these things. So you had a real crisis. I mean, this is the kind of thing that leads to the Arab Spring in the Middle East and so on. But one thing opened up, which was the Gulf. So a whole bunch of the young people found jobs in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and UAE and places like that. They went there, worked for 10, 20 years, got their nest egg, and now they're back. And now they're old, so they're not working. And Sri Lanka, because of its low population growth, has actually now turned into a labor shortage economy. So they have managed the youth bulge and the boom by going overseas, by using, and in all of these, the common thread in all of these is that Sri Lanka has always used the external market, whether it's for the IT industry or the garment industry or the labor market. The huge potential, and regardless of how restrictive, distorted the domestic economy is, you can always make use of the external labor market. So I think the bank should recognize that and try to work around, try to work on what you can do for Sri Lanka to grow despite the distortions, rather than try to remove the distortions. Even though that's a good thing to remove those distortions, I don't think it'll ever happen.
Thank you. I think we've kind of overrun a bit. So let me, before I hand over to Amira for the Q&A session, it's often said, Sri Lanka has had 16 programs with the IMF, and where has it got us? And I must say, listening to us, I think I'm beginning to understand better why we have perhaps not got anywhere near as far as we could have done. And the fault seems to be on both sides. I think there are, as you pointed out, there are lessons for both sides as to how we can make this relationship work better and ensure that there is a constructive engagement that is supportive of Sri Lanka's growth and development. With that, Amira, let me hand over to you for the Q&A session.
Good evening, everyone. As indicated previously, if you do have a question, you can either post it on the chat box or you can raise your hand and we will enable you to speak. Dr. Devarajan, we'll take a couple of questions together. The first one is, haven't the Bretton Woods institutions cushioned economies and currencies and thereby prevented reforms? That's one. We have a bit of a lengthy question from Mr. Musin, who has worked in the Zambian government for 12 years, as well as the World Bank for 17. So he says that he's worked both inside and outside. While commending the World Bank and the IMF, he says, the great thing is that the criticism sits lightly on these institutions, and as they know, they are doing the right thing. But when they are wrong, they, the IMF and the World Bank, take time to admit their mistakes. Can Shantha refer to some of the mistakes made and lessons learned? Shall I take one more question?
Sure.
We might agree on the hard truth that Sri Lanka has been in a vicious cycle of a debt trap where we obtain loans at high interest rates, not with a lot of conditions from other countries. In your view, is there any way that the World Bank or IMF can intervene at the moment? What sort of assistance is available for Sri Lanka at the moment for any form of effective structural reform?
Okay. Good. Thanks very much. And it's really nice to hear from Musa, my old friend. I guess these are separate questions. The first one is a very good question. Have they, by cushioning these economies, have we avoided or enabled them to persist without reform? And I think the example I gave of Kenya earlier is a good one, because Kenya got 3 structural adjustment loans in a row for the same condition, which was the same agriculture maize policy reform. Now, you think about it from the Kenyan point of view, you realize you don't have to do this reform. They're going to give you the money. So they, and as you know, reform is politically very difficult. And frequently the loan actually, the right word is cushion, but it buys you some breathing room, some space to avoid doing the reform. And actually, let me give you the other example of Kenya, which is a really nice one. So people were all worried about corruption in Kenya. This was in the late 80s, early 90s. And there was high corruption. So in 1992, the donors, all of them, the World Bank, IMF, British, French, whatever, they all got together and said, we're going to cut off aid to Kenya. So they literally, the aid just went to zero overnight, right? During that year, 1992, Kenya enacted the most reformist tax reforms that they've ever done. Kenya's tax to GDP ratio is 23% now. I mean, compare that to Sri Lanka, 14% or something like that, right?
About 12 or less.
12%, yeah, whatever, right? And but because they had no choice, right? The donors cut off the aid, so they had no money. They had no money coming from the outside. They had to raise the money. So they undertook the tax reforms. These are all tax reform proposals that were sitting on the shelf that many of us had designed and proposed to the Kenyans. They never did it, except when the donors cut off aid. In fact, Michael Bruno, who was then the chief economist of the bank, said, we did more for Kenya by cutting off aid for 1 year than we did for the previous 40 years by giving them aid. So that's a very good point, and we have to keep that in mind on that. Musin's question about criticism. Well, I think what I described about the conditionality is a criticism, and let me go a little bit further on that. So what we observed was that we had 10, 15 years of structural adjustment loans with traditional conditionality, Washington consensus type policies, and Africa still didn't grow. So the question was, and so that's a criticism. It's a criticism on both sides. But I think we took the lesson very to heart. Actually, we did the analysis and then took the lessons to heart, which was that these were reforms that were not owned by the country. There was no political consensus to undertake the reforms in the country. Now, the thing to remember is that the subsequent 15 years, say from mid-1990s to 2010, Africa's growth rate doubled. And you can ask the question, what's the difference? Now, some of it was commodity prices, but actually, we've had commodity price booms in the past that didn't work out so well. The main thing, and then you look at what policies were undertaken by the African governments during that 2000 period, they were exactly the same as the Washington consensus. Every single one of them, trade liberalization, financial market deregulation, exchange rate undervaluation, those kinds of things, right? The difference was they were actually designed by the countries themselves. By that time, you had a cadre of finance ministers, central bank governors, permanent secretaries who were well-trained, who were appointed there on merit, not by being the president's son-in-law or whatever. And they basically sat down and said, okay, what do we need to do? And they came out with a set of policies. So these were owned by the country. These were the ones that were specific to the country. They had the local knowledge, and they designed policies that looked just like the Washington Consensus. But the difference was, since they were designed in the countries, they actually were implemented and sustained. So I always say, you know, my good friend Danny Roderick keeps saying that the problem with the Washington Consensus is the consensus. I think the problem with the Washington Consensus is the Washington, right? There was nothing wrong with the consensus. The policies were the right policies, but the fact that they were designed in Washington and London and Paris actually made a difference compared to being designed in Abuja or Nairobi or Dar es Salaam. Third question, what should the World Bank and IMF, what can the World Bank and IMF do to intervene at this stage? I mean, the World Bank, at least, I guess, is already intervening in various ways, and the IMF is always there. I think there are two areas where I would emphasize. One is the debt restructuring I mentioned earlier, that I think the IMF is actually in a position where they can actually provide technical assistance. I emphasize it's not that the IMF is going to impose conditions, it's that you actually design a debt restructuring program using their expertise, and as Indrajit said, their global expertise, to develop a program of debt restructuring that would then actually bring in all the other creditors to Sri Lanka. And the second, on the World Bank side, it's the knowledge. I think there's tremendous potential to use the kind of knowledge that the World Bank produces, but use it in a strategic way. So use it to help build the consensus in the country. We should stop thinking of the World Bank projects. I mean, products, the reports that we write. I mean, frequently we did report. I did reports, and others did reports. But we would give that report to the government, give it to PB Jayasundar and say, here, you know, give us your comments, take a look at it, and whatever. But I don't think PB needs to read those reports. He already knows what's in them, right? But the public needs to know. And it's the public who should be informed with these reports. Then we need to get it out in Sinhala and Tamil, get it out in a way that people can understand. Let me give you one example. I really like this experience I had in Tunisia, you know, going back to the Middle East. We did a report on cronyism in Tunisia, where we showed that the friends and family of the Ben Ali regime were actually owned the businesses that received the most protection in the country, and that actually contributed to the high unemployment in the country and to the Arab Spring. Now you can imagine how this report was received by the cronies themselves. I mean, the people who were in the government. We had to go and present it to them, and they were polite but basically ignored it. But what we did was we created a cartoon video of the report. You summarized the main messages in a cartoon video and translated it into Tunisian Arabic. And this video just went viral, went all over the country. And the next thing you knew, I would go and see the same minister who refused to talk about the report. He immediately started talking about the video, the cartoon video, because his kids had seen it and they were telling him about it. And he had to talk about it because he had no choice. This is what you can do in Sri Lanka. Because I think what Sri Lanka is stuck in is this low-level political equilibrium where, based on information that is not credible on both sides, the public has different perceptions and therefore will not vote in favor of reform. But if we can get that information out there so that the public actually is informed and get it in a way that they can absorb it, we might be able to make more progress.
Jaffarji, would you like to pose your question?
Yes, I think you can hear me.
Very
Yeah,
well.
sure.
Yeah, okay. So my question is actually to both Indrajit and Shanta. This is Murtaza here. So Indrajit, your career has spanned over quite a few decades, and you have had the experience of both the parliamentary system and executive presidency system. So my question is really about the political system and the reform space. And then you have also served overseas, overlooking many other Commonwealth countries. And Shanta, you have been an advisor or worked within the World Bank and dealt with many different countries who probably have different political systems. So I would like your comments about the different political systems and how they played out in the reform agenda.
Shanta, why don't you go first? Yeah.
Okay, I was hoping you'd go first so I can think of an answer. My first reaction, Murtaza, is that I've seen good and bad political systems, good and bad politics in different political systems. So I almost don't think the political system itself matters very much. So I've seen the Westminster style system, the presidential style system. We have both in Africa, South Asia, and other places. And frankly, they both suffer from the same dysfunctionalities. So you have the political capture in a Westminster style system. You can have the same political capture in the presidential style system. You can have paralysis in both. And you can have autocracies in both. I mean, some of these parliaments in the so-called Westminster style system are rubber stamp parliaments. But then you have presidential systems as well, where the president wins by 95, 96% of the vote. And that's not a representative system either. So I don't worry that much about the type of presidential system, type of political system. And frankly, it doesn't matter what I think because it's what the people think, right? I mean, it's what they want. I think given the political system, the important thing is how do you work with it to make it better, to make the policies better, and that better policies emerge from that system.
I think if I can, I very much agree with what Shanta said in the sense that, one can be pretty agnostic about the political system or even the economic system. You've got good outcomes, with the different political systems, as Shanta said, and even with economic systems. You've had statist policies, you have market-driven policies, giving good outcomes and bad outcomes. So in the end, it is the outcomes that matter. And what has delivered those outcomes? What has delivered consistent, predictable policies? And where does the balance between economics and politics work out in a way that you can deliver good outcomes? You cannot divorce economics from politics entirely. In all countries, politics does play a role in terms of economic policymaking. But in some countries, politics overwhelms economics. And Sri Lanka is one such country. When politics overwhelms economics and consistently does so, then you invariably don't get the best possible outcomes. So that's one thing. And let me just share one bit of experience. When I was at the Commonwealth, there was an eminent persons group chaired by Dr. Manmohan Singh when he was in opposition at the time, which looked at the nexus between democracy and development. And interestingly, one bit of empirical finding was that if you looked at the autocratic states, they are disproportionately represented among the high performers, and they are disproportionately represented amongst the failed states. The democracies tend to muddle through in the middle. Okay, so I mean, you can make what you like of that, but what I say is really you have to have a system that gives you good outcomes in terms of policies. And that's basic principles of economics. You can't essentially violate them for any period of time and be successful.
Dr. Nag?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me, Amira?
Yes, I can, Dr.
Yeah.
Nag. Please go ahead.
Shanta, great to hear you. Thank you very much. And Indra, great to see you too. I wanted to raise a point, Shanta, which is implicit in everything you have said, which is institutions. I was with the Asian Development Bank, so we have partners in crime in many of the things you have said. And of course, you know, I empathize and agree with everything you have said about conditionalities, performance, etc. My question essentially, Shanta, is we, the development community, have spent by now billions of dollars on institutional strengthening. And I'm going broader than just organizations. I'm talking about corruption, anti-corruption commissions, cronyism, the whole works, rules, regulations, etc. And quite frankly, now that I'm sort of, you know, retired from the Asian Development Bank, and I can be more honest with myself, I suppose I'm not fettered by any institutional boundaries. I'm having a huge trouble thinking of success stories, and I'm trying to sort of, you know, think it through. And your example of Tunisia, that video, is just terrific. I mean, you know, question is, one, can you tell me about some success stories of institutional building which have been sustained, which have really made a difference? I'm not talking just about forming a commission, and they did form it because we said so. And then, of course, the brother-in-law of the prime minister was appointed as the anti-corruption commissioner. That's one. Some success stories, because we all know the failures. And second, in Tunisia particularly, in spite of that video going viral and everybody talking about it, was it sustainable? I mean, 5 years later, has it made a difference, or was it just big talk, cheap talk, as one would say? So those are my questions, and grateful for your advice.
Should I take that question? Because we don't have much, or you want to take a few more, Amira?
I can read you a couple of more questions from this end.
Okay.
What are the options available of a debt restructuring without IMF? That's, do you want one more?
Okay. Yeah, that's a short question. A short answer.
Reports of Bangladesh Central Bank lending $200 million from foreign exchange reserves have been used to put Sri Lanka's economic management in bad light. Can you provide some clarity?
Report of Bangladesh?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anything about this. Indrajit, maybe you do?
The Central Bank of Bangladesh just provided a swap facility of 200 million USD to the CBSL. Yeah.
And there's a part two to that. What did Bangladesh do right to reach this advantage in its economy?
Okay, all right. I'll try to answer that, but you may have to help me out on this one.
Yeah.
Okay, let me take Mr. Nag's question first. I like it. You know, I think we as in the international development community have been approaching the institution issue the wrong way. And that's one of the reasons why we suffered. And it's implicit in your question when you said we've spent billions of dollars. We still slip into this idea that all you need is dollars and you can build institutions. And we pump this money. And there are at least two problems in that. One is that what are institutions? Institutions are a set of incentives facing the people inside those structures. It's whether people are actually motivated to undertake, to stop being corrupt or to reduce corruption and things like that. Most of that doesn't require a lot of money, but it does require a lot of change in hearts and minds. And as we know, the money may not be the way to do it. The second is that institutions like the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, the money goes to the government. And that's maybe the problem, because it's the government that you're trying to fix. If the money goes to the government for anti-corruption, and it's the government that is corrupt, you're hardly going to make a big difference to the institution. So I think we have to really rethink the way we approach institutions to say, this has to come from the bottom up. We have to use our knowledge, coming back to the earlier theme, to be able to inform the public so they demand less corruption. And there are lots of little things you can do. I will give you, I mean, do you know about the 0 rupee note? I mean, there was this beautiful example in India, in South India, where they printed a 0 rupee note. And basically all they did was, so if a government official asks for a bribe, you give it in a brown paper envelope, sealed brown paper envelope, but you just give 100 0 rupee notes. And of course, you just give him the bribe and you walk away, and he does whatever you asked him for it. And then next thing you know, he realizes, and they realize just from that one little experiment that the gig is up. And they did one of these randomized control trials, and they found that the places where they used the 0 rupee note to pay bribes, corruption went down. So there are little things like that that you can do in order to change the incentives facing people. And I would say we can do a lot more of that than the big anti-corruption projects and public sector reform projects that we try to do, because they're just pushing on a string. Then can you do debt restructuring? Just quickly, you asked about Tunisia. I think Tunisia is unique in the Arab world. Most of the other Arab Spring countries have either gone back into repression or civil war. But Tunisia, the thing that is standing firm is the democracy. They did move into a multi-party democracy, and that has withstood, in fact, changes in government from one party to another several times. It's still going through a difficult period in getting the economy growing again, because the politics again is still very strong. I mean, many of the Ben Ali cronies are out, but not all. So some of them are still in there, trying to grab power. And the labor unions, the UGTT, which is the most powerful labor union, is still very powerful, and frankly is standing in the way of a lot of potential reforms to the Tunisian economy. On the debt, as I said, it's a short answer. I don't think that it's possible to do a debt restructuring without the IMF. Now, what does it mean without the IMF? It's without the IMF playing a coordinating role. It doesn't mean that you have to have an IMF program, but the IMF is the institution that the rest of the creditor community has entrusted as being the coordinator of a debt restructuring process, because you want it to be a well-structured process. You don't want it to be a bunch of bilateral deals. That's the worst way to do debt restructuring. So you get the IMF to play that coordinating role, and they're willing to play it, by the way. I mean, I've had some discussions with them for Sri Lanka. Now on Bangladesh, I can answer the second part of the question. I just don't know much about the 200 million swap. What did Bangladesh do right? I mean, first of all, Bangladesh is still a poorer country than Sri Lanka. I mean, their per capita income is significantly lower, but they have done remarkably well. And it comes back to the point that I was making earlier. They do it remarkably well because they're very, very powerful civil societies. The famous Grameen Bank, and BRAC, to the extent to which public services like health and education are basically delivered by these NGOs. And the advantage there is that first, these people are intrinsically motivated. I've gone to these BRAC schools and visited the Grameen clinics and things like that. And you can see, I mean, these young people, they get paid very little money, but they're really determined to make this work. And you have a whole movement of a whole country that operates that way. But the second thing about Bangladesh that's worth keeping in mind, it's not just the public services, but their garment industry has done superbly well as well, is that it's a country where And it helps to be a fairly homogeneous population and a fairly densely populated country, because an innovation spreads like wildfire throughout the country. So, you set up a garment factory, and the next thing you know, you have 2 million women working in the garment factory. Some NGO introduces family planning, and next thing you know, the whole country is on birth control. So they are able to scale up innovations in an incredibly rapid way, and that has served them well. I just don't know the details about the 200 million. I'm not sure that the fact that they give you a 200 million swap shows that Bangladesh is higher than Sri Lanka. It's just that they have the money and they can actually undertake the swap. Is that right?
That's right. No, in a sense, I mean, as a friendly South Asian neighbor, I think they've provided a swap to the Central Bank of Sri Lanka to address the present dollar illiquidity. So that's what this swap arrangement does. You're muted.
You're on mute, Amira.
You're muted.
Sorry. The next set of questions. In your experience, what lessons are useful to design a homegrown reform program in a country like Sri Lanka?
Good.
The question is, who gets to decide what reform is important? He says, I've seen firsthand instances where the government sought World Bank assistance, technical and financial, for a reform area that is considered important and was supported by underlying evidence, but it wasn't a priority in the eyes of the country's leadership and as such didn't get resourced by the bank. Can we take one more?
Sure.
Dr. Devarajan, one more question?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
If government of Sri Lanka asks for the support from IMF, people say they will definitely ask the government to open its economy. Why do you think the government of Sri Lanka and the people are so afraid of opening its economy? Do you think opening economy will help long-term economic development in Sri Lanka? We have more questions, but that's enough for the time being, I think.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. These are getting more and more exciting questions. I like the question about the homegrown economy, homegrown reform program, because I think that the word homegrown is important there, but it has two parts to it. And that's, if you look at the experience elsewhere, one is that the people involved in the design, the government officials in the design, are truly meritocratically appointed. If you have the president's brother-in-law designing the program, no, in Turkey, it's the president's son-in-law, I think, who was the central bank governor and made a colossal mess of the monetary policy there. But you have people like Indrajit Coomaraswamy, who are technocrats. You have the ingredients of a homegrown. But the second part, which is even more important, having the technocrats, is that the voice of the people is heard in the policymaking circles. And this, frankly, this is something I find lacking in Sri Lanka. I mean, let me give you an example. And this might turn to the other question as well. Saman Kelagama has this beautiful book called Economic Policy in Sri Lanka, where he interviewed all the great men, mostly men, who designed economic policy in Sri Lanka, Gamini Korea, Laja Wadana, all the great people. And it's a beautiful book because it's a real window into how economic policy is designed. And I read the whole book, and it struck me that all the chapters talk about how, Laja Wadana talks about how he met with the World Bank representative and he met with the IMF before designing the reform program and so on. None of them talks about how they met with the people of the country. There was no mention of town meetings, consulting focus groups, the average man and woman whose lives are going to be affected by these reforms. So I find that in Sri Lanka, there is still a bias towards that the economic reform is something that the cognoscenti should design. And to the extent that you consult anybody, it's the IMF and the World Bank. Whereas the people you should be consulting are those in the country. So I think a truly homegrown program, like the examples I was giving you of Uganda and Ghana, is one where you consult the people first. You actually get a sense. And I think the fact that Sri Lanka is a democracy also, there's a sense of, there's a complacency that just if you're elected, once you're elected, you don't need to go back and consult the people till the next election. But that's just not true. That's what we've learned the hard way over the years, which is that we need to be consulting the people all the time, especially if we're undertaking reforms that are going to affect their lives. And they should know, and they should have a chance to express their opinion. And by the way, you learn a whole lot when you do that. I mean, I've done these focus groups, and there are lots of things that come up that you never thought about when you do it, even if you are a well-trained economist. Now, the open economy, yes, frankly, this is a puzzle to me as well. Because if there's any country that's a textbook example of how beneficial opening up the economy is, it's Sri Lanka. Look at what happened in 1979 or 1977 onwards, right? That's when they liberalized the first round of liberalization of the trade regime, and the place just boomed. It's as if, I mean, I often use the Sri Lankan case of 77, 79 in my classes, because if I want to teach students about the benefits of trade reform, and they say, okay, but does this ever happen in real life? I say, here, look at Sri Lanka. Right? So the Sri Lanka is considered the textbook example. And yet, what I'm puzzled by is there's still a sort of feeling that trade openness is bad for us, or it has all sorts of nefarious effects. And let me just say, there is absolutely no basis for that statement for a small country like Sri Lanka. There is the argument for a small country. The argument for a small country like Sri Lanka, a small open economy like Sri Lanka, being protectionist is vacuous. There is no argument. There's just really no benefit to protectionism in this in a country like this. And as I was saying earlier, if you look at how Sri Lanka managed to grow even in the last 20 years, despite a civil war and tsunami and all sorts of other convulsions, all of the sources of growth have been taking advantage of the global economy. Because you've got Sri Lanka is a small country and it's a small economy, but the global economy is a trillions of dollars economy there. And the best thing you can do is to take advantage of it. And by taking advantage of it, I mean both exporting and importing. And in fact, I would go as far as to say, I don't know, I mean, how many controversial things I can say in 5 minutes, but I would say that you also want to take seriously the idea of importing labor. Just the same way that Sri Lanka did so well by exporting labor. It's just like you do well in exporting if you also open up your imports for goods. Now you can do very well in output, in production, if you import labor to satisfy some of these labor shortages that the country is facing, particularly in the high skill sectors.
Can I, Amira, just add a postscript to what Shanta said about openness? I think for me, the classic example for the benefits of integration with the global economy and openness is if you look at China. What you said about small countries clearly is true, but you look at China, you look at the progress that has been made in the coastal regions, which are far more integrated global economy, and compare it with the hinterland, which is way behind. just by looking at China's experience in development, you can see the benefits of integration. And the Chinese, of course, now are the biggest defenders of a rule-based, open international trading system because they've seen the benefits. And may I just throw one other question before we wind up, Shanta? And that is, there is, of course, a justifiable concern that if you go in for an adjustment program, you have to impose austerity measures. Because after all, you need an adjustment program because your balance of payments is unsustainable, or your budget is unsustainable, or both, and effectively you're living beyond your means. So you have to compress domestic absorption. By definition, the way you get out of the problem is by compressing. So is it, from your experience across countries, what are the trade-offs in terms of going early or leaving it later? I mean, have you seen high costs of delaying in your experience?
Good. Let me just add one footnote to what you said about China, Indrajit, because it also might be relevant for Sri Lanka. China also had a whole bunch of loss-making state-owned enterprises, right? And they politically, they couldn't get rid of them. They couldn't close them down. But what they decided to do was to ring fence them. So they said, okay, you keep those enterprises, they will lose money, but don't interfere with the rest of the economy. So we will have this very profitable, very open, labor-intensive, manufacturing, export-oriented economy. And that's just going to boom. And that it did boom. And we just tolerate those state-owned enterprises rather than, struggling to reform them. And they just, again, they took it as given. They're politically,
another distortion you can't do anything about. Yeah.
Can't do anything about, right. So just don't worry about it, but make sure the rest of the economy is booming and keep the separate, keep them away from polluting the rest of the economy. Now, austerity, this is a very good question. Is it better to do it quickly? It's the shock treatment versus step-by-step liberalization. And it can go both ways. In terms of cuts, say expenditure cuts, it is better to smooth it as much as you can. So I would say that would be the kind of backloaded reform program. But the one where people make a mistake, I think, by doing it gradually, is exchange rate reform. Sometimes some governments say, well, we're going to devalue the exchange. You got a country, and I have one I'm working on right now, South Sudan, where the official exchange rate is 200 South Sudanese pounds to the dollar, and the parallel exchange rate is 500, right? So there's a huge overvaluation of the official exchange rate. But they're worried about, and by the way, fuel is provided at official exchange rate. So this is a huge subsidy for fuel that's involved in that. But they're nervous about just increasing the official exchange rate to the parallel rate right away. So they have announced a plan whereby, it's going to go up by 1% every day till the two converge. And you can see that that's a recipe for disaster. So with exchange rate, you actually need to do it quickly and do it now. The costs of delay are huge. But things like expenditure cuts, because expenditure cuts, especially on health and education, can have permanent effects on human capital.
And clearly you have a pandemic, right? You have a pandemic.
Right? You have a pandemic, right? You don't want to have austerity in those things that are needed in order to preserve the health and education of your people. Now, by the way, I should add, and because I've done some work on this, not all health and education expenditure is productive. So there's plenty of room to cut health and education expenditure without undermining the health and education of your people. And this includes in Sri Lanka. I also don't accept that, well, we can't touch health and education. You have to actually improve the efficiency of health and education. And the pandemic is a particularly important area where a case where you need to do it urgently.
Do we wind up now, Amira?
I think we better, Dr. Coomaraswamy. We have plenty more questions,
Oh,
but I think we've already run, I think, about
and
20
I think
minutes.
Shanta has to go in about 5 minutes,
Yeah,
right?
10
Yeah,
minutes. Yeah, but can you send me the questions and I'll answer them directly?
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Why
I
don't you
can-
forward them to Shanta? He said
Yeah.
he'll do that. That's great.
will
Thank
do
you very much, Shanta. Anyway, let me, Shanta, this has been really extremely good. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time to join us. It's been very instructive. I think, such a wide canvas that you covered, and really tremendous kind of knowledge that you've shared with us, drawn from a really wide and experience at a very senior level. So let me thank you very much. Let me also thank Amira and her team for putting all this on for us. And above all, thank you, all of you who participated in this. I hope you found Shanta's deliberations helpful. So with that, let me thank everybody, and have a good evening in Sri Lanka and a good day in Washington, Shanta.
Okay, thank you very much. This is
Take care.
very
Bye.
interesting.
Mr. Gunatilka, are you going
Thank
to
you.
say, are you going
Thank
to say
you.
anything?
No, I just want to thank Shanta and also you, Indrajit, for a very excellent program, very informative. And I'm sure those who joined us would have found it very interesting. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone. Have
Thank
a good
you.
night. Be
Good
safe.
night. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Shanta.
Bye.